Hello, I'm Mario Toneguzzi, and I'm taking care of business. Joining me today is Mike Holden, Vice President of Policy and Chief Economist for the Business Council of Alberta. Mike, the labor force numbers came out today from Statistics Canada, showing Alberta had a gain of about 8,200 jobs in February. Unemployment rate dropped from 7.2% to 6.8%. Tell me what's happening in the province.
Well, we're seeing, so the jobs that you mentioned, we're seeing a continued economic recovery in Alberta, and where we're seeing a lot of those job gains this time around is in some of these forward-facing hospitality type of industries that had been hard hit before, and they're starting to come back, and we're seeing a bit of an increase in those areas, partly due to a small loosening of restrictions in February, and we're looking to see that continue as the momentum carries on. So that's really the source of where this job growth came from. The unemployment rate fell by quite a bit. In spite of relatively modest job gains, and that was largely because of fewer people looking for work in the province. And so as the participation rate falls, that tends to drive the unemployment rate lower than the sort of total number of jobs growth would otherwise suggest.
What was, when you looked at those numbers, how does it break down between full-time and part-time jobs in the province?
Yeah, well, we actually saw a decline in full-time work of somewhere between 9,000 and 10,000 jobs, and about 17,000 part-time jobs were created. And I think what we're seeing there is it's a function of which industries in particular were impacted the most or had the most movement in this particular month's worth of jobs numbers. So we saw, on the whole, in spite of 8,200 jobs, that was that's modest, but there were strong gains across most industries, with a couple of major exceptions. Transportation and logistics was one, and finance related occupations was another. And those places, though, those industries tend to employ full-time people. And so I think that what we're seeing in part is that this decline in full-time jobs was because those industries saw a decline in total employment, whereas the industries I mentioned earlier, these hospitality, tourism, bars, restaurants, those kinds of jobs, the ones that are starting to come back, those tend to be part-time positions. So we're seeing that on the whole, we're seeing an increase in part-time jobs offsetting a loss in full-time jobs. Okay,
let's look at the Calgary region. Unemployment rate fell from 8.5% to 8.0%. StatsCan says there were 15,000 plus jobs, 15,100 to be exact, jobs created in February. What's all this tell you about Calgary's market?
Well, those are really solid numbers for Calgary. And I think if you looked at, if you just to compare for half a second, Calgary versus Edmonton, there was a pretty substantial decline in the Edmonton market. And that's a bit of a reversal from what we've seen over the last several months, where, from last summer going on to maybe December, it was largely Edmonton that was driving jobs gains. And for the last month or two, it started to reverse course. And so we're seeing, renewed activity in Calgary. We've seen a number of announcements of, new businesses moving in or planning to set up shop in the province. And so, we saw large job gains, and that unemployment rate drop that you mentioned is pretty substantial. And what makes it even better is that, Calgary's always been a place where people are actively looking for work. And so the labor force participation rate in this city is usually one of the highest in the entire country. I think it's the third highest of any major city across Canada. And so because of that, and that increased considerably. So that drop came in spite of the fact that more people were looking for work. So Calgary still has a high unemployment rate compared to most other cities, but it's coming down, and it's coming down in spite of the fact that we have even more people looking for work. So in a sense, that's a doubly positive sign for the city.
Let's take one quick look at the national scene. 337,000 jobs created in February, but the unemployment rate dipped 1 percentage point to 5.5. It's near a record low in Canada. And what's happening on the national scale?
Well, what we're seeing there is, so almost all of those jobs were created in Ontario and Quebec. And there were a large number, proportionally speaking, of jobs created in Newfoundland and PEI as well. And especially in the case of Ontario and Quebec, what a large part of that is is that we saw a large dip in employment in January in those provinces because of increased COVID restrictions that were put in place there. And in those provinces, we saw those restrictions ease in February, and there was a large snapback in employment. And so, comparing February to December, the jobs are still up, but it's not as large an increase as this sort of month-over-month number suggests, because a lot of those were regained jobs that were lost in January from that most recent shutdown.
All right, and just one last question. We'll go back to Alberta and Calgary. What can we expect in the coming months when it comes to the labor market here?
Well, there are a couple of things we can expect. First of all, on sort of the very short-term basis, we had a full lifting effectively of all COVID-related restrictions across the province at the beginning of March. And so none of that is reflected in these jobs numbers yet. And so I think that in the very short term, we can expect to see a more substantial recovery in some of these hospitality hard-hit industries, the ones that still have yet to recover from February 2020 levels. Then I think longer term, there's the provincial economy is doing very well. It's buoyed in large part by commodity prices, oil and gas, agricultural products. And, those don't necessarily tend to translate into large jobs gains, but there are a lot of other things happening in the city as well. We've seen a lot of new tech investment, a lot of companies that are starting to move into the city, and some general major project activity, plus health in the oil and gas sector will help drive jobs gains. So I think that there's an optimistic future ahead of us, I think, over the next year or so, and we'll start to see some of those jobs numbers continue to improve.
All right, super. Thanks, Mike, for joining us today.
No problem. Thank you.
All right, that was Mike Holden, Vice President of Policy and Chief Economist with the Business Council of Alberta. I'm Mario Toneguzzi. This has been Taking Care of Business. Thanks for joining us today.